I've always believed that family is supposed to be your safety net, the people who catch you when the world tries to break you. But in my case, family was the very thing that made me feel broken in the first place. My name is Daniel. I grew up in a small town where appearances mattered more than anything else. My parents worked hard, but we were never considered wealthy. My father was a mechanic who took pride in fixing things with his hands, and my mother worked part-time at a bakery. We had a modest house, a rusty old car, and a life that, while not glamorous, was filled with love, at least inside the walls of our little home. Outside of it, things were different. You see, my father had a younger brother, my Uncle Richard. He was everything my dad wasn't: wealthy, polished, and constantly flaunting his success. Richard had built a small empire out of real estate, flipping properties, and climbing his way into the upper class. He loved expensive suits, imported wine, and above all else, he loved being admired. The problem was that admiration often came at the expense of belittling others. And unfortunately, I was his favorite target. Danny boy, he used to call me, with that smirk of his. Still wearing those bargain shoes? Tell me, does the glue hold them together when it rains? I'd force a laugh, even though I hated it. My father would clench his jaw but stay silent. He never liked confrontation. My mother would just lower her gaze, trying to avoid escalating things. And me, I'd swallow my pride, pretending his words didn't sting. But they did, every single time. Richard had 2 kids, Lucas and Marissa. They were both spoiled from the moment they could walk. Designer clothes, private schools, summer trips to Europe, you name it. They looked at me like I was beneath them, a peasant cousin they had to tolerate during family gatherings. I remember one Christmas vividly. I must have been around 12. Everyone was gathered in Richard's lavish home, where even the chandeliers seemed to sparkle with arrogance. When it came time to open presents, Lucas unwrapped a brand new gaming console. Marissa squealed with delight as she received diamond earrings. And me? Richard handed me a thin envelope with a sarcastic grin. Inside was a gift card to a thrift store. "Figured it'd suit your style, Danny boy," he said, as the room erupted with laughter. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. That night, I cried myself to sleep, not because I wanted expensive gifts, but because I wanted dignity. Over the years, this pattern never stopped. If anything, it grew worse. Every birthday, every wedding, every family reunion, it was like stepping into a battlefield where my self-worth was the weapon of choice. And Richard wielded it mercilessly. When I turned 18, I made a promise to myself I would build a life so strong, so successful, that one day he'd choke on his words. I worked hard, earned scholarships, and got into a good university. Unlike Lucas, who breezed through life on his father's dime, I had to juggle part-time jobs, internships, and endless nights of studying. But I did it. I graduated top of my class, landed a job at a financial firm in the city, and slowly began climbing the ladder. I didn't flaunt, I kept my achievements quiet, partly out of humility, partly because I didn't want Richard to find new ammunition. Years passed. My parents were proud of me, but Richard never changed. He still called me Danny boy, still found ways to mock me at gatherings. He assumed I was just scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck in the big city. One evening, I came home from work to find my father sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an old wooden box. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. "Dad, you okay?" I asked. He cleared his throat and pushed the box toward me. "I think it's time you see this." Inside was a stack of papers, yellowed with age. I carefully unfolded them and froze. It was my grandfather's will. My grandfather, Richard, and my dad's father had passed away when I was very young. I barely remembered him, just vague images of a gentle man with kind eyes. But what I was holding now sent shockwaves through me. The will stated in no uncertain terms that his estate, including a sizable inheritance, was to be divided equally between his 2 sons, my father and Richard. But here's the thing. My father had never received a cent. He had never mentioned it, never complained, never fought for it. He simply carried on, raising me with love, working tirelessly, while Richard flaunted his wealth. "Dad, What is this? Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed heavily. Your uncle. He was the executor of the will. After your grandfather died, he convinced everyone, including me, that there was barely anything left after debts and taxes. I was too naive to trusting. I didn't push back. And, well, here we are. I was speechless. My chest burned with anger. Richard had stolen from us. He had built his empire not just on business deals, but on betrayal, on robbing his own brother. And now, years later, he still mocked us for being poor. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind. Every insult, every humiliation, every moment Richard had looked down on me. And now I knew the truth. The wealth he flaunted wasn't just his. Half of it should have been my father's, half of it should have been ours. I clenched my fists, my jaw tight. For years I had endured his mockery. But now I had something powerful. Something that could turn the tables. I had his old will, and I knew exactly when I would use it. Because Richard had planned a grand family gathering for his 60th birthday, a lavish event where he invited everyone he knew, from business partners to distant relatives. He wanted the night to be about his glory. But for the first time in my life, it was going to be about mine. Richard's 60th birthday was not just a celebration, it was a spectacle. He had rented out the grand ballroom of the most expensive hotel in town. A glittering space lined with crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes. The kind of place where every fork on the table had to be placed just right. And the servers wore tuxedos that probably cost more than my father's entire wardrobe. When the invitation arrived in the mail, my mother looked hesitant. Do we really have to go? She asked, setting the envelope down on the counter. My father gave a tired sigh. He's my brother. If we don't show up, he'll use it against us for the rest of our lives. I picked up the card and read the gold-embossed letters. It was as arrogant as Richard himself. Join me in celebrating 6 decades of success, legacy, and family pride. Legacy. The word burned in my chest, because I knew the truth behind that so-called legacy now. We'll go, I said firmly. But this time, things will be different. The night of the party, I dressed in a tailored navy suit. It wasn't flashy, but it fit me perfectly. And for once, I didn't feel like the poor cousin arriving at a palace. My parents came with me, my mother in a simple but elegant dress, and my father wearing his best shirt, the one he saved for holidays. As we walked into the hotel, the scent of roses and champagne filled the air. Guests mingled in clusters, laughing and clinking glasses. A massive banner hung across the ballroom, "Happy 60th, Richard, to many more years of greatness." And there he was, my uncle, standing near the stage, basking in attention. His silver hair was slicked back, his suit crisp, his smile smug. Lucas and Marissa hovered nearby, greeting guests with the kind of entitlement that came naturally to them. When Richard spotted us, his eyes gleamed. He walked over with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Well, if it isn't Danny boy," he boomed, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I was beginning to think you couldn't afford the gas money to get here." Laughter erupted from those around him. My cheeks heated, but I forced a polite smile. "Good to see you too, Uncle." He clapped me on the back a little too hard. "That suit borrowed, I assume? Looks almost real." The laughter grew louder. My father's face stiffened, but he didn't speak. My mother looked at the floor. Inside, I was boiling. Not tonight. Not anymore, I thought. Dinner was cervo lobster tails, filet mignon. Food most of the guests probably ate weekly, but that my parents and I rarely tasted. As the servers moved around pouring wine, Richard stood and raised his glass. "To family, friends, and the empire I've built with my own 2 hands," he declared. "May we continue to prosper, and may we all know our place in this world." His eyes flicked toward me as he said that last part. Subtle, but deliberate. Lucas smirked and added, "And may some of us aspire to do better then?" "Well, whatever it is, Danny does." A ripple of laughter swept through the table. I clenched my fists under the tablecloth. My career, my achievements, they knew nothing about them, and they didn't care. They had already decided who I was. The poor cousin. The failure. Tell us, Danny, Richard said, leaning back in his chair, swirling his wine. How's life in the big city? Still living in that? What was it? Shoebox apartment. I took a deep breath. Actually, but he cut me off. Don't tell me you've finally upgraded to something with working plumbing. The table roared with laughter. Even some distant relatives I barely knew joined in, eager to stay on Richard's good side. I swallowed hard, my chest tight. Every instinct told me to shout, to throw the truth in his face right then and there. But I held back. The time wasn't right. Not yet. After dinner, Richard announced a surprise, a charity auction. But it wasn't charity in the noble sense. It was just another excuse for him to parade his wealth. Tonight, he said, grinning, I'll be auctioning off a few items from my collection. All proceeds will go to, well, let's just say a cause close to my heart. Lucas wheeled out a display of luxury items, a vintage watch, a rare bottle of wine, a designer handbag. Guests eagerly raised their paddles, tossing around thousands of dollars like pocket change. When it came to the last item, Richard gestured dramatically. And now a final piece, something truly special. A gold-plated fountain pen. The very pen I used to sign my first $1 million deal. Applause filled the room. Richard scanned the crowd, then his gaze landed on me. Tell you what, he said with a sly smile. Why don't we start the bidding with young Daniel here? Surely even he can spare a few dollars for his uncle's keepsake. My stomach twisted. He was baiting me, setting me up to be humiliated in front of everyone. I'll pass, I said calmly. He raised his eyebrows. Come now, don't be shy. What's the harm in a little fun? Unless, of course, it's out of your budget. Laughter again. The sound was like knives in my ears. Lucas leaned over and whispered loudly enough for others to hear. Maybe he can pay in installments, 50 cents a month. The crowd chuckled. I stayed silent, my jaw tight. Inside, though, I was already picturing the look on Richard's face when I unveiled what I had in store. As the night went on, the insults piled up. Every time I opened my mouth, Richard found a way to twist my words, turning them into a punchline. My parents sat quietly, enduring it, as they always had. Finally, the birthday cake was wheeled out, an enormous 5-tiered confection covered in gold leaf. The room erupted in applause as Richard cut the first slice, posing for photos like a celebrity. When it came time for guests to give speeches, Lucas nudged me. Go on, cousin. Say something. We could all use a laugh. I shook my head, but Richard jumped in. Yes, Danny boy, let's hear from you. Surely you've got something inspiring to say, from your vast experience of mediocrity. The guests chuckled, some hiding their smirks behind champagne glasses. I rose slowly, feeling every eye on me. My hands trembled not from fear, but from anticipation. This was it. The humiliation had reached its peak. The setup was complete. Actually, I said, my voice steady, I do have something to say. The room fell silent, surprised by the firmness in my tone. Richard smirked, expecting a stammering speech he could tear apart. But he had no idea what was coming. Because tonight the tables were about to turn. The ballroom lights shimmered above me as I stood, clutching the microphone. For years I had endured the ridicule, the endless jabs, the way my Uncle Richard made me the punchline of every gathering. But this time I wasn't trembling with shame. No, this time I was trembling with anticipation. I looked out over the sea of faces. Some smirked, expecting me to embarrass myself. Others looked curious. My parents, sitting quietly at the end of the table, looked nervous. My father's hand gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles white. My mother avoided eye contact, as though bracing for another wave of humiliation. I cleared my throat. First, happy birthday, Uncle Richard, I said evenly. 60 years is a big milestone. You've certainly accomplished a lot. Polite chuckles floated through the air. Richard leaned back in his chair, smug, swirling his wine like he already knew he'd won. But tonight, I continued, my voice steady. I want to share a story, a family story, one that I don't think most of you here have ever heard. The room quieted. Conversations halted. I felt the shift, the subtle pull of curiosity. Richard raised an eyebrow. A story, Danny boy. This should be good. I took a deep breath. When I was younger, I used to wonder why my parents lived so modestly while my uncles seemed to have everything. My father worked himself to the bone, yet we never had the luxuries that others did. And every family gathering, I was reminded of it. I paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. Some guests exchanged glances. Lucas smirked, whispering something to Marissa, who giggled behind her champagne glass. But recently, I continued. I came across something that explained it all. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folded yellow document. My hands trembled not from nerves, but from the gravity of the moment. This, I said, holding it up for all to see, is my grandfather's will. The room erupted in murmurs. Richard's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he forced it back into place. "Oh, for heaven's sake," he scoffed. "Dragging up ancient paperwork at my birthday party." "Really, Daniel?" But I pressed on. "The will clearly states that my grandfather's estate was to be divided equally between his two sons, my father and Uncle Richard. Yet, somehow, my father never saw a dime of it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads turned toward Richard. He shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. "That's nonsense," he snapped. "Your father chose not to take anything. He didn't want the burden." I looked directly at my father. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. Then, quietly but firmly, he spoke. "That's not true, Richard. You told me there was nothing left after debts. I trusted you." The room fell silent. You could hear the clink of a glass being set down somewhere in the back. Richard let out a forced laugh. "Come now, we're celebrating tonight. No need to dig up the past. This is ridiculous." But I didn't let up. "Ridiculous. You stole from your own brother. You've built your so-called empire not just on real estate, but on lies and betrayal." A wave of whispers surged through the guests. Some looked shocked. Others leaned in, eager for the drama. Lucas and Marissa's smug expressions had vanished, replaced with confusion and unease. "You have no proof," Richard said sharply, his voice rising. "That paper doesn't mean anything without context." "Oh, but I do have proof," I replied. I unfolded another sheet from the folder I carried. "Bank records. Transfers made from my grandfather's accounts directly into yours weeks after his death. All under the guise of settling debts. Funny, though, how none of those debts ever existed." I laid the papers on the table in front of him. His face drained of color. He didn't reach for them. He couldn't. The murmurs grew louder, turning into audible gasps and mutters. One of Richard's business partners leaned over to whisper something to his wife, his eyes narrowing at Richard. "I always wondered," I said, pacing slowly, "why my uncle mocked me so relentlessly. Why he took joy in calling me poor. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe deep down, he knew that the wealth he flaunted wasn't fully his, that it came at the expense of his own brother." I turned to face the crowd. "You see, my father never fought back. He never confronted him. He chose peace over conflict, dignity over greed. But that dignity came with a cost, years of struggle, years of humiliation. And while we worked hard for every scrap, Richard sat in luxury. On stolen foundations." The silence was deafening. Every eye was on Richard now. His smirk was gone, replaced by a scowl. "This is slander," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You don't know what you're talking about." But the desperation in his voice betrayed him. One of the older relatives, Aunt Margaret, stood up from her seat. "Richard, is this true? Did you take everything from your brother?" Richard sputtered. "Of course not. He's twisting the story." But then my father, who had remained quiet for most of the night, finally rose. His voice was steady, but heavy with decades of suppressed pain. "All these years, I believed you. I believed my own brother when he said there was nothing left. I raised my son with honesty and hard work. And you mocked us for being poor when you knew. You knew the truth." The room erupted. Guests murmured louder, some shaking their heads, others glaring at Richard. I took a step closer to Richard. You always told me to know my place. Well, tonight, Uncle, I think everyone here sees exactly where your place is. For the first time in my life, Richard looked small. His shoulders hunched, his face red, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Lucas spoke up suddenly, his voice cracking. Dad, is this true? Richard snapped at him. Quiet. But the damage was done. His own children were questioning him now. I held the will high. This is the legacy my grandfather intended. Not greed, not betrayal, but equality. He wanted both his sons to share in what he built. Instead, one brother stole and the other suffered in silence. Gasps filled the air again. Cameras flashed, guests were already pulling out their phones, recording every second. And I smiled inwardly. This was only the beginning, because tonight, Richard's empire of lies was starting to crumble right in front of the very people he sought to impress. The ballroom was no longer filled with laughter and clinking glasses. It was filled with whispers, sharp stares, and the sound of Richard's empire cracking piece by piece. The very stage he had chosen to bask in his glory had turned into the stage of his reckoning. I lowered the will onto the table in front of him. My voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of decades. For years, Uncle, you've paraded yourself as a self-made man. You called me poor, mocked my family, and wore your wealth like a crown. But tonight, everyone here knows the truth. That crown was stolen. Richard's face twisted in rage. He stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. This is outrageous. Lies. Do you think anyone here is foolish enough to believe? You. I built everything I have through hard work and vision. But his words rang hollow. I could see it in the guest's eyes. Doubt had crept in, and doubt is poison to a man who lives off reputation. One of Richard's longtime business associates, a sharp man in a tailored suit, stepped forward. Richard, if this is true, if you manipulated a will, then everything you've ever claimed about your fortune is tainted. Did you steal from your own brother? Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He glanced at me, at the papers spread across the table, at the eyes boring into him from every corner of the room. His silence was answer enough. Gasps echoed. Someone muttered, unbelievable. Another said, all these years. Lucas and Marissa stared at their father like he was a stranger. Marissa whispered, Dad, how could you? Richard's hand shook as he slammed his glass down. Enough. This is my party, and I won't have it ruined by lies and jealousies. But his voice cracked, and the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Then something I'd never seen before happened. My father, quiet, gentle, always the peacemaker, stood tall. His voice was strong, almost thunderous. For 60 years, Richard, I let you have your way. I stayed silent while you mocked me, while you mocked my son. I told myself peace was worth the sacrifice. But tonight, I see that silence only made you bolder. Well, I won't be silent anymore. He turned to the guests, his voice steady. My brother stole from me. He cheated our family. And while he grew rich, I worked with my hands every day just to put food on the table. I never wanted luxury. I wanted fairness, dignity, and he robbed me of both. The crowd erupted in murmurs, again this time angrier, harsher. The judgment had shifted. Richard wasn't just a man being accused, he was a man being condemned. Richard staggered back, sweat glistening on his forehead. You can't prove anything in court, it's been too long. Statute of limitations. The desperation in his voice was pitiful. He wasn't the untouchable king anymore. He was a cornered man, babbling excuses. I stepped closer, my voice low but firm. Court? Maybe, maybe not. But tonight isn't about courts. Tonight is about truth. And the truth is out. Everyone here knows who you really are. I gestured to the guests. These are your business partners, your friends, your admirers. How many of them will still stand beside you tomorrow? How many will trust the deals you've made when they know your empire started with theft? Cameras flashed again. Guests recorded his meltdown, some whispering furiously into their phones. I could see it in his eyes. He knew his reputation was collapsing in real time. Then Lucas, his own son, stood up. His voice trembled. "Dad, all those years you bragged about building everything from nothing, it was all a lie. You stole from Grandpa. You stole from Uncle James." Richard snarled, "Shut your mouth, boy. You live off what I built. Don't you forget that?" But Marissa rose too, her voice sharp with betrayal. "What you built? Do you mean what you stole? You humiliated Daniel for years when you were the real fraud." Gasps echoed. The betrayal from his own children landed like a final blow. Richard's face collapsed into something broken, something small. I turned to the crowd. For years he called me poor. He used his power to humiliate me, to humiliate my parents. But wealth doesn't define worth. Integrity does. And tonight you've seen the difference between the two. I raised the will high again. This is my grandfather's legacy. A legacy of fairness meant to be shared. But Richard twisted it for greed. And now his lies are undone, not by lawyers, not by judges, but by truth itself. The room erupted in applause, low at first, then louder, stronger. Some guests even stood clapping in support of my father and me. Richard's face was crimson, his eyes darting wildly as the sound swallowed him whole. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the center of admiration, he was the center of disgrace. Richard tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the applause and murmurs of disgust. Guests were already pulling away from him, distancing themselves physically as though he were contagious. One of his closest partners stepped forward and said coldly, "If what I've seen tonight is true, Richard, we're done. I don't do business with thieves." Others followed, murmuring agreements, shaking their heads, walking away. His empire of respect, built over decades, was crumbling in minutes. Lucas shook his head in disgust. "I can't even look at you." He walked out of the ballroom. Marissa followed, tears in her eyes. Parents sat stunned, my mother clutching my father's hand tightly. My father looked at me, his eyes glistening, not just with pain, but with pride. Richard stood alone in the center of the room, his hands trembling. The man who once towered over everyone with arrogance now looked like a hollow shell. "You think you've won, Daniel?" spat, though his voice cracked. "You'll never have what I have. You'll always be beneath me." I stepped closer, meeting his bloodshot eyes. "No, Uncle. I already have something you'll never know. Respect. And that can't be stolen." The guests applauded again, louder this time, drowning out whatever comeback he tried to muster. Richard's face twisted, his body shaking with fury and shame. He shoved the papers off the table in a fit, sending them scattering across the floor, and stormed toward the exit. But as he passed through the doors, the sound of whispered judgment and scorn followed him out. His throne had crumbled, and he had no kingdom left. I turned back to the crowd, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. My voice softened. Tonight wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. And the truth is, no amount of stolen wealth can ever outshine integrity. My father may not have riches, but he has honor. And to me, that's worth more than any empire built on lies. The applause swelled, some guests even cheering. My father bowed his head humbly, tears slipping down his cheeks. My mother squeezed his hand. And me, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like Danny Boy. I felt like Daniel, the man who had finally stood up, not just for myself, but for my family. The ballroom emptied slowly, leaving behind echoes of murmured conversations, and the faint clinking of glasses being cleared away by staff. The grand chandelier still sparkled, but the air felt different, lighter somehow, no longer weighed down by Richard's arrogance. I stood with my parents near the corner of the room, watching as the last of the guests filed out. Some stopped to shake my father's hand, offering words of respect. Others gave me a nod of approval, subtle but sincere. For the first time, people weren't seeing us as the poor side of the family. They were seeing us as what we truly were: honest, dignified, resilient. My father exhaled deeply, almost like he'd been holding his breath for 60 years. His shoulders relaxed, his eyes glistened. "I never thought I'd see this day," he whispered. I put a hand on his shoulder. "You deserved it, Dad. Grandpa wanted fairness. He wanted you to have dignity. Uncle took that away, but tonight, he took it back." My mother smiled through tears, her voice trembling. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Daniel. So proud." As we stepped out of the hotel, the cool night air hit my face, refreshing and sharp. The city lights flickered in the distance, a stark contrast to the storm that had just unfolded inside. Behind us, Richard's voice could still be heard faintly, shouting at someone, his manager maybe, or one of his business partners. His empire wasn't gone yet, but the cracks were wide and spreading. And unlike the wealth he once stole, reputation is a currency you can't reclaim once it's spent. I turned my focus back to my parents. My mother clutched my arm as we walked, as though afraid I might vanish. My father, usually so quiet, looked 10 years younger, relief etched across his features. "I never wanted revenge," he said softly, almost to himself. "But truth feels like justice." I nodded. That's all I wanted too, for everyone to see him for who he really is. That night, back at my apartment, I sat alone for a while after my parents went to bed. The will lay on the coffee table, its yellowed pages fragile but powerful. I stared at it, thinking about my grandfather. What would he think if he could see us now? Would he regret trusting Richard with such responsibility? Or would he simply be glad that the truth had finally come to light, even if decades late? I closed my eyes and pictured his face, gentle, kind, always smiling when I toddled into his lap as a child. In my heart, I knew he'd be proud. Proud that we didn't let the lies define us. Proud that I stood up, not just for myself, but for the family name he worked so hard to build. News traveled fast. Guests who had recorded Richard's meltdown posted clips online. Within days, whispers turned into headlines in the local business community. Words like fraud, betrayal, and deception clung to Richard's name. His business associates backed away. Deals collapsed. His empire started to crumble. Not because of lawyers or judges, because trust, the foundation of any success, was gone. Meanwhile, people reached out to my father. Old friends, distant relatives, many called him brave. Some apologized for never questioning Richard's behavior. My father, humble as ever, simply said, "I only spoke the truth." As for Lucas and Marissa, they kept their distance from Richard. I heard through the grapevine that they were furious, embarrassed by what they learned. For the first time, they saw the reality behind their privilege and the shame that came with it. I went back to work, back to my own life in the city. But I felt different, stronger, lighter. For years, I carried the burden of being the poor cousin, the target of endless humiliation. But now, that weight was gone. I realized something important. Wealth isn't about what you have. It's about who you are when everything else is stripped away. My uncle had mansions, cars, prestige, but none of it mattered when the truth surfaced. Without honor, he had nothing. I, on the other hand, had something far greater. I had resilience. I had family who loved me. And now I had respect, not just from others, but from myself. Weeks later, I ran into Richard by chance. He looked different, thinner, paler, like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His suit was still expensive, but it hung on him loosely, as if even fabric was reluctant to cling to him. He spotted me across the street. For a moment, I thought he might ignore me, pretend I didn't exist. But instead, he crossed over, his steps slow. "Daniel," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "You've ruined me." I met his gaze steadily. "No, Uncle, you ruined yourself. I just told the truth." His lips trembled, his eyes darting away. "You think you've won?" I shook my head. This was never about winning. It was about setting things right. For the first time in my life, he had no comeback. No smirk, no insult, no arrogant jab. He simply turned and walked away, shoulders slumped. And in that moment, I realized something. He wasn't the giant I had feared all my life. He was just a mana-broken man living in the ruins of his own choices. As I look back now, I see the story for what it truly was. Not just a battle between an uncle and a nephew, but a battle between lies and truth, arrogance and dignity, greed and integrity. My grandfather's will wasn't just a legal document, it was a symbol of fairness. A reminder that legacy is meant to be shared, not hoarded. Richard tried to bury that legacy under greed, but truth has a way of resurfacing. And for me, the lesson is clear. Silence may keep the peace, but it also allows injustice to grow. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak, even when your voice trembles. I am not Danny Boy anymore. I am Daniel. And my story is not one of poverty, but of resilience, truth, and justice. So if you ever feel small, mocked, or belittled, remember this: wealth fades, reputations crumble. But dignity, once reclaimed, shines forever. And that is the inheritance I choose to carry. And that's how the truth finally came to light. My uncle thought he could bury the past forever, but justice has a way of catching up. What do you think? Did he get what he deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I love reading every single one of them. If you enjoyed this story of family betrayal and revenge, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story I share. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.